with this computer. All right, so let me introduce to you the wonderful, oh my gosh, Lisa Padden. Lisa works with in UCD, and she is the head of the University for All. She has a number of different things she's going to talk about today, but mostly we're looking at UDL and assessments with UDL and inclusion in mind when we're creating these as lectures and how to go forward in that kind of work. So I want to thank Lisa very much for her time. We will have time for questions and such after. So we're looking forward to that. So let me just see if I can let you share your screen. I'm sure I can. Spotlight, make host, allow move, put a link, remove, report. Well, how do I dename Mac? I don't think I'm gonna, I think I'm not gonna remove you. I don't think that, I guess I need to make you host. That seems to be the only way, or is there another way, Lisa? You know this.
So if there should be a little arrow beside the share screen, and if you click that, you should have options to allow multiple people to share their screen.
Okay, multiple people can now share certain times. Great. So off we go.
Very good. Thanks, William, Rebecca. And it's always a delight to talk to you in IADT. So I'm sure you know we worked very closely on a project a couple of years ago, the inclusive assessment and feedback case studies. And I have to say it was an absolute pleasure to work with everybody down in IADT. The creativity and innovation, I think, that you're all engaged in when it comes to teaching and learning really added a huge amount to the work that we're doing in UCD. So it's fantastic. So it's a little bit about what I do in UCD. So as Rebecca said, I work in the University for All initiative. So I'm the program manager for University for All, and University for All is essentially UCD's access and inclusion initiative. So it looks to weave inclusion into the fabric of the institution and not just have it be the task of a designated access office or access person, but actually make it everybody's day-to-day work to make sure that we're embedding access and inclusion in absolutely all aspects of what we do. So traditionally, access was thought about in terms of opening doors for students and, you know, letting students into the institutions, but actually what we're talking about in inclusion and in University for All is making sure that we're as inclusive as possible in every aspect of the student's journey. So not just their admission, but their full participation and success within their academic programs as well. And we're really focusing on making sure that all of our access students feel welcome, they feel like they belong in the institution, and they feel like they're valued. And universal design for learning is one of the core frameworks that we're using really to embed inclusion across the university. One of the pieces of work that we're doing is our University for All faculty partnership program. So again, that's built on universal design for learning. We have 27 partners across UCD in all the different disciplines. So all colleges are represented. And they are the champions essentially for universal design for learning. Now, I don't like to use the word champion because champion sounds always like an extra job that you don't get paid for. But this is a funded scheme. So we were able to use some strategic funding that we got from the HEA, which was actually through the Fund for Students with Disabilities, to fund these 27 partners to really become the UDL person in their area. So all of these faculty partners work with me in terms of promoting the Universal Design for Learning digital badge, which I'll talk about shortly, and actually facilitating it for their colleagues. So this is just to emphasize that the University for All initiative really is, it includes that teaching and learning aspect, but it also includes student supports and services, the built environment, and the tech infrastructure. So it's taking the whole institution approach to access and inclusion. And I think this is a nice way to think about it. So it's kind of moving on from the deficit model where we might have looked at a student and thought, well, what is that student missing, or what does that student need? And how are we going to fill that gap? But actually we're turning that completely on its head and going, well, what is the institution missing? And what do we need to change in order to be inclusive of this diverse student population? And so UDL might have originally been associated with students with disabilities, but when we talk about universal design for learning, we're talking about the full diverse student population. So students with disabilities, but also low-income students, mature students, part-time students, students who are coming in through further education awards, so and international students, so all of the diversity that we have. So it's about looking at the institution, looking at all of those areas that we talked about and going, where do we need to make changes? Or do we as an institution have to make those systemic, strategic interventions to make sure that we're inclusive for all of our students? And that's not something that's ever going to happen overnight, but I think the Universal Design for Learning framework helps us to make those kind of iterative changes to our programs, to our assessment, that mean we are bit by bit, we're becoming more and more inclusive for all of the students across our programs. So I think it's useful as well to start off by thinking about what those barriers might be for students, and how do we get this student all the way through to their graduation and success, and what are some of the barriers that they might face in their program. So it might be admission to the program, it might be even just having the knowledge, who do I ask questions of, so that kind of cultural capital piece. And I think that's something that maybe we don't talk about enough when we talk about Universal Design for Learning, is that cultural capital of, well, I have a sibling who went to college and I can ask them questions, or my parents went to college, or, I have all of this institutional knowledge that maybe another student doesn't. So I was first generation college student. So when I went to college, there was nobody I could ask questions of in terms of where should I go? How should I do this? What do I need to do? So I relied entirely on what I got from the institution and the support I got from the institution in order to be able to succeed. So it's, I suppose, again, back to challenging the assumptions that we might make about some of our students. Obviously, financial barriers, and Universal Design for Learning can help students to, I suppose, overcome those financial barriers, but help us to remove those systemic barriers. So, have a look at your program. What are the financial expectations? Do students need to buy equipment? Are you saying that there's a field trip? Is it an optional field trip? And how much does it cost? What are you going to do about the barrier that's there for students who don't have that financial means to actually take up that piece of extracurricular activity? Do they have the materials that they need? Do they have the skills that they need? So are we making assumptions about the base level math skills or tech skills that students have, or the access that they have to technology? And we saw just how, I suppose, disadvantaged lots of students were when we went online, and they didn't have the correct equipment and they didn't have the reliable internet connection. And what can we do in terms of universally designing our programs to make sure that we're accounting for the fact that students have different types of equipment, we're providing that equipment where necessary and if possible. Academic skills are another thing that we assume in our student population. And again, looking at Universal Design for Learning and building in that skill development so that students can really feel as though they're expected in the classroom. It's not unusual if they have never written an essay before, done a presentation before, that you're actually expecting that level of diversity among your student population. And we know as well that students are juggling a million different things in their lives, and they are very time poor. Just like academics are time poor, students are time poor. And we need to look at students' workloads when we're talking about Universal Design for Learning as well. So we'll talk about inclusive assessment shortly, and diversity of assessment. And what we don't want to do is equate diversity of assessment with multiple assessments. So bringing in that kind of over assessment piece. And that has been an issue for, I suppose, in some programs in UCD, where the introduction of diversity of assessment actually turned into, well, now I have 2 pieces of assessment that I have to do every week, and the workload becomes a little bit unmanageable. So really looking at that is very important. And we know as well, we have students who are managing medical appointments, and what do we do about that? Are we providing materials? Are we providing recordings? What are we doing for students who maybe can't attend on a particular day? And then, of course, the time piece. So what are we doing about making sure that we're not putting unnecessary time burdens onto students? And that can be something as simple as providing an annotated reading list to students so they know exactly which piece of a text they should be looking at. Or it can be all the way down to actually really working out how many hours is the student spending on this course. Because quite often around a module descriptor, there's this kind of standard, okay, it's going to be 100 hours, and then you kind of, fit in, it's going to be 20 hours of autonomous learning, it's going to be this many hours of lectures, but actually spending a bit more time across your program to consider what that time load is, and asking students as well how much time they're actually spending on all of those components. So I like this one as well in terms of comparing differentiation to UDL. So in terms of, there's a particular student who's presenting with a support, I'm going to give that student a support. And the usual example is a student with a disability, right? So they're going to come along, they might get a piece of assistive technology, which is great, extremely useful for students. But how does that then line up with Universal Design for Learning? Well, differentiation is giving a student a ladder to get over the wall. So we're not removing the barrier. The barrier is still there, but we're giving them a leg up so that we can help them to navigate the barrier. But universal design for learning is about removing that wall altogether. So it's about eliminating the need for the student to need the leg up, to need the ladder. And I think if you look at maybe students who have challenges with reading as one example. So you can give a student with a disability a piece of technology, a piece of text-to-speech software, some read aloud software, so they can use that. They can get their text from you, and if it's online, okay, that's great, they can use it straight away. If it's a print text, they can scan it in and they can still use their technology, or maybe they can use a reader pen to do it. But what if we actually look at the curriculum and we look at the platform that we're using and we build in a read aloud or a text-to-speech piece of software onto the virtual learning environment, so any student can read their text aloud or listen to their text or convert their text into an MP3. That's beneficial for every single student in your population. It doesn't mean that the student with disability isn't getting their support, they're still getting their support, but it does mean that that hidden diversity among the student population is accounted for, because it's something that's useful for every single student. So I think it's useful to think about, what are we doing? Are we helping a student overcome the barrier, or are we removing the barrier altogether? And we should be trying to remove those barriers every time we identify one. And we focus as well on the +1 approach. So this is Thomas Tobin's approach to universal design for learning, where we make these small changes that together will have a significant impact on the experience of your learners and on you as an educator as well. So as we go through the session and talk about assessment and talk about inclusive assessment, I'd encourage you to think about one small change that you might make after this session, whether that's in one individual piece of assessment, maybe in a piece of training, or even a resource that you're giving for students. All of those things do add up to, I suppose, a fully inclusive module at the end of the day. So in the piece of work that we did with IADT previously, we looked at universal design for learning. So you're all very familiar with that. So we looked at representation, action and expression, and engagement. We looked at universal design for instruction, which is looking at those, I suppose, simpler guidelines, really keeping things simple and intuitive, perceptible, flexible, looking at size and space, making sure there's low physical effort, tolerance for error, and that we create a community of learners. And those I suppose principles are much more in line with the universal design principles. And then we looked at how those mapped on to the inclusive assessment concepts. And the inclusive assessment concepts will be based on a lot of work that's been done both in Ireland and elsewhere, but particularly by the National Forum. With that, then we came up with this I suppose, list of principles that you can go through when you're thinking about each of your individual pieces of assessment, and you can see how they map on to universal design for learning. So I'm going to talk you through these, and then we're going to do an exercise. So the first thing that your assessment and feedback should be is transparent. So students should know from the beginning how they're going to be assessed in their module. So they know, okay, if I choose this module, it's going to have an essay, it's going to have a presentation, it's going to have a piece of project work, and I know exactly when that's going to be due. So students can see that assessment strategy right from the beginning, that it isn't, you wait until week 6 and then you tell students what they're going to be doing at the end of the module. Or you say, well, it's 70% continuous assessment, but you don't tell students what that continuous assessment might be. So best practice would be to have that information right up front for students, so they do know exactly how they're going to be assessed. Very importantly, they know what percentage that piece of assessment is for their overall grade as well. And that helps students to manage their time a little bit better. So we know that quite often access students, or those students from the groups traditionally underrepresented, are those who are the most conscientious, and particularly mature students can tend towards perfectionism as well. So you might give somebody maybe a journal writing task that's only maybe worth 5%. Should be something the student can get done very quickly. But actually a student who maybe doesn't have that cultural capital of that knowledge might spend days, hours, a very long time on a very small piece of assessment. And if if you haven't been very explicit about how much time it should take, or what your expectation is, or what it's worth in terms of a percentage, then you're leading students down that potential path of actually not being able to manage their workload very well. So full transparency in assessment is important in terms of the mechanics. So how am I being assessed? When am I being assessed? What is it worth? But also in terms of why you've chosen that assessment method. So this is kind of trusting your students as partners in their own education and going, well, we've chosen a presentation for this, and that's because it's really important that you are able to demonstrate this skill, that skill, the other skill. So students really understand why you've chosen to assess them in a particular way. The assessment then, the second principle is that your assessment is scaffolded, and that simply means that students are supported to succeed in the mode or method of assessment that you've chosen. So if you're choosing an essay, that you actually teach students how to write an essay. Or pieces of writing that they can have a look at. But essentially, you're not making any assumptions about the skills the students bring into your classroom. You understand that there will be students of different varying levels of skill when it comes to a particular assessment method. And that might mean, you know, essay writing or presentations, but even exams. Like exam technique is something that students do need to be taught if you're going to choose to do timed exams. So again, having a look at your assessment strategy for a particular course that you're teaching. At what point are you teaching students those skills that you expect them to have in order to be able to succeed? So, I mean, ultimately, a piece of assessment is about being able to demonstrate that you've met the learning outcomes, but it becomes a lot more than that when you actually dig down into the method of assessment that you're using, because you are also expecting them to be very skillful, whether it's, you know, verbal presentations, creating a PowerPoint, creating a podcast, whatever it might be. There's always a skill that's associated with that method of assessment, and we need to work with students to make sure that they have it. Choice of assessment very clearly means in a module that you give somebody a choice between doing A or B. So a presentation or an essay, a project or an exam, whatever it might be. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in a minute, as well as variety of assessment or diversity of assessment, which is really looking first of all at your module to make sure that you have more than one method of assessment within that module for students, but also looking at your program across an entire program, working with your colleagues to map out where that diversity of assessment is. So making sure again that you're building in the skills at every level of the program, and you have diversity of assessment within your program as well. Authentic assessment, and I mean, based on my experience previously with your colleagues in IADT, authentic assessment is something that you all do very well. And essentially that means an assessment that is linked directly to the discipline or the subject that you're teaching. And really making sure again that you talk to students about how this is an authentic assessment. So one of the examples in the case studies is a kind of capstone project in business that your colleagues in IADT did. It's a shared piece of assessment, a really authentic piece of assessment in terms of this is something that a student may well be expected to do when they go out into the world of work based on what they've studied. And this is giving them a chance to practice that, to perfect those skills, to really develop the skills that the program is expecting them to have, and the graduate attributes that you would expect your graduates to have. So authentic assessment, I think it's a useful lens to look at your whole assessment strategy as well. Giving students an opportunity to self-monitor or self-assess. And I think looking again at the timing of your assessment. So if your first piece of continuous assessment that students do isn't until week 4, week 6, up until then, really, they don't know where they are in the module. So they need to be able to see whether or not they've gained the skills they're expected to gain, whether they've understood the key concepts that you're teaching. So giving them some quick and easy tools to use, and quite often there's options through your virtual learning environment to do this. Some quick tools that they can use to check to make sure that they're where they should be in the module. And this doesn't necessarily have to be something that's part of your part of the grade. So it can be something they just use themselves, but it can be very useful. Opportunities for students to assess or peer review, again, really useful in terms of engaging students in that principle of providing options for engagement. So working in groups we know is very useful, and it was something that was more challenging when we were remote. But looking at peer assessment and some very structured peer assessment, I think sometimes the issues that students have with peer assessment is they don't know exactly what they're supposed to be doing, and it is a skill to be able to peer assess. And those of you who have studio modules will, I mean, you could talk a lot more than I could about it, but actually teaching students how to do that peer assessment, how to engage with it, and actually how to get the best out of the peer review or peer assessment that they get back on the other side as well. So I've mentioned already the importance of the programmatic approach, and I think it really can't be overstated in terms of actually working with your colleagues across a whole program. And I mean, that goes for universal design for learning or inclusion approaches in general, that they're always going to be more effective if you can implement that program across a wide ranging aspect. So looking at, when a student comes in, their full journey through first year, second year, third year, whatever it might be with the length of your program, looking at how they're being assessed, how does that link into the program outcomes, the graduate attributes, at what point are we teaching students these skills that they need, at what point are we introducing them to this authentic assessment, in a very supported way. Having supportive policies in your institution is obviously really important as well, and opportunities for staff development so people can come together to do, we'll say, maybe a programmatic review of assessment in a structured way, and they're supported to do that. So from the student perspective, what do students want? And this is from a survey that we did in UCD back in June 2020. So we had over 2,000 responses from students. And we did ask about assessment in one of the questions. So what do the students want around assessment? Well, they want assessment that motivates them, but isn't punitive. And I think that's a nice way to look at it. And another piece of research that AHEAD did a few years ago talked about expecting students to succeed. And I think that comes into assessment quite a lot. And I think it's nice to do something like when students come in, tell them, you've already got 100%. It's up to you now to maintain that 100% as we go through, rather than, you start at 0 and you have to build it up. But it can be very motivational for students to think about, well, you're expecting them all to succeed, and then they can live up to that. Students want assessment that makes sense. So that links back to the kind of authentic assessment again. They want maximum flexibility. So looking at, are there any points at which students only have one choice and they only have to do one thing? Well, how can you expand on that and do that gradual kind of introduction of flexibility as well? And they want clarity and not mystery. So making sure that from the beginning, as I said, students know how they're being assessed, why they're being assessed, and there isn't any kind of, well, I'll tell you next week, or I'll tell you the week afterwards, or don't worry about that yet, we'll get to that. But the students are worried about it, and they're worried about it from the beginning, because that's just the nature of a program where students are taking multiple modules at the same time. They're always going to be worried about how they're going to be assessed and if something is going to pop up as a surprise to them that they haven't had time to prepare for. Just a few words, because this is one of my, probably get on my soapbox, inclusion in the pandemic pivot and some of the positive things that we learned during that. And this is a wonderful, scary image of the RDS set up for exams with the sea of chairs. So we did see a lot of positive changes happen when we were online. So the students' needs were more visible and more immediate. So we saw lecturers all of a sudden becoming very, very aware of the students who didn't have what they needed, or needed technology or needed support or didn't understand what they're being asked to do. The large exams halls weren't used, which was a real positive. There was a move to other assessment types. So this is where our colleagues who'd already embraced universal design for learning and had built in their diversity of assessment had a lot less work to do when it came to actually changing their assessment strategies. And we saw people start to build in diversity of assessment who had maybe never considered that before, or always thought it was going to take too long or be too difficult, or take too many resources. And we saw the complete elimination of exams in some disciplines. And there are very few, unfortunately, who've maintained that as we've returned. So we did a piece of research in 2020, myself and Geraldine O'Neill, who's from UCD Teaching and Learning, who has a wealth of fantastic resources. I'm sure you've come across her already, particularly on choice of assessment and diversity of assessment. So we looked at what the barriers and enablers were to diversifying assessment. And actually, while we did the survey in June of 2020, we have been planning it before COVID. But we rolled with it, given the context. So we looked at where educators had diversified their assessment, and I'll talk to you about how we defined diversity of assessment in a second. And we asked them for an example of where they had implemented that. We asked them what the benefits were to diversifying their assessment, whether or not it was successful, and what the association was between their familiarity with the assessment method, the required resources, so time and funding, and the success. So we'll talk about that. So we had 160 of our academic colleagues respond, and they were in general a very experienced bunch. So more than half of them just over half of them had more than 15 years experience. Only 19% had ever introduced choice of assessment. So choice of assessment is something that people are much more reluctant to introduce. And I think because it is much more of a departure from what we're used to in terms of our assessment methods. And there was a wide cross-section of disciplines represented in the study that we did as well. So choice of assessment was a very straightforward definition. So it's where each student in a module has a choice between 2 or more different assessment methods. So the classic example, a poster or a presentation, and they choose one of the assessment methods. So sometimes people think choice of assessment equates to alternative assessment. So where you might have a student with a disability who requests an alternative assessment. But choice of assessment, as we define it, really is something that has to be open to every single student in your classroom. And then diversity of assessment. So we played around with this definition quite a bit, and we consulted with colleagues before we landed on this. So a diverse assessment method is where an assessment method is introduced that's less familiar, either to you as an educator or to the students, or both, and increases the range of assessments in your discipline. So something less familiar. So that doesn't mean that it has to be something completely new and innovative to education in general. It just has to be something that's new to you. So replacing an end of semester exam with something less familiar, and that could be an essay depending on what discipline you're in and whether or not essays are generally used or not, or an online or a take-home exam. So in terms of the barriers to implementation, this was the perception of our colleagues, and this was an open text response that we then coded. So lack of time, no resources to support the change, a fear of grade inflation, and that was an interesting one, equity of the assessment to previous other assessments. So people were very worried that they weren't going to be able to achieve that equity, and a lack of examples from their discipline. So people really wanted to be able to see where somebody else had done this and it had succeeded, and here's why it had succeeded and what should they do with that. So you can see it was the same barriers that were there for diversity and for choice. And the one I want to pick up on just for a second is the fear of grade inflation. And that wasn't something that Georgie and I had talked about previously or considered. But to explain a bit more, the issue was that people were worried that the more inclusive their assessment got, so the more diversity of assessment they introduced, the better students would do, and that would be difficult to explain to people like their external examiners or their program boards. So that kind of was a revelation to us, that was something people were concerned about, because we don't grade on a curve. And surely we do want and expect all students to do well. And we would expect that that would be an outcome of a curriculum that had, I suppose, undergone a universal design for learning change process. So it's just interesting to think that that's still the mindset, and there is still a reputation, or academics feel as though modules where students all do very well are not well respected. Because there should be an expectation that some students will fail your module or not do well. And that's, I think, disturbing on lots of levels. But I think it is something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about inclusive assessment and the expectations that we have for our students. I mean, going back to what students want, and students want us to expect them to succeed. But if we go in thinking, you know, high grades is a bad thing, then that's going to be an issue. In terms of how we create and sustain the positive changes, so the examples and case studies came up very frequently in terms of the research outcomes. And you can see some of the case studies that we've done most recently are case studies in engineering and architecture, and more collaboration and dialogue. So more opportunities to talk with colleagues about teaching and learning, about assessment, about that diversity piece, and more institutional support. So I think institutional support for universal design for learning, where diversity of assessment, they're actually built into the policies, into the systems that we use even to record our assessments, things like that. And then finally, to listen to students. So I think it's very important in terms of the feedback process that we close that loop. So asking students about their experience of diverse assessment and building in the feedback to the next year, and talking to students about how you've built in that feedback as well. Some of the benefits that were reported in the research to diversity of assessment were better student engagement. Students felt more empowered because they could choose a method of assessment that worked well for them, or felt that they were represented in the diversity that was there. And it did accommodate the learning needs of diverse students in my module. So lots of students came, or lots of educators came back with that. In terms of defining success, this was interesting as well. So we asked people whether or not they felt it was a success, and those that felt it was a success We asked them to tell us why, and then we coded those reasons. So improved student engagement, again, improved learning experience. They got positive student feedback from students. There was good student performance, and they felt that the diverse assessment methods had assessed their learning outcomes more accurately. And this is the really important bit. So we found no statistically significant correlation between whether or not something was a success and how much time or resources it took, or how familiar it was. So things were equally successful whether they were very familiar or not, whether they took lots of resources or didn't. So the perception is that to introduce choice of assessment or diversity of assessment, it's going to take a lot of time and resources. But actually that's not the case. So there's lots of successful initiatives that didn't take lots of time and resources. So I think it's about kind of being brave and maybe changing the dialogue around UDL and inclusion and how much time it takes, because it can take as much or as little time as we want it to. In terms of implementing choice of assessment, there's some key principles to follow. So first of all, stick to 2 choices. So students find it overwhelming when they get lots and lots of different choices, particularly students who aren't used to having choice of assessment. So sticking to 2 choices can really help with that. Use Sturgeon O'Neill's equity template, and I'll show you that in a second. Have some examples of your assessment type and work on that skills development piece. So again, if you're introducing the option of doing a podcast as an example, that you have some resources for students there so they can develop the skills that they need to create a podcast, and that's really important. Sometimes, well, very frequently, I would see, and I would meet with lots of the participants who do the Universal Design for Learning badge nationally, and they'll have introduced choice of assessment and been really disappointed about the fact that not many students picked what they consider to be the more diverse method of assessment. But quite often it's because students are reluctant to pick something, obviously, that they're not very familiar with. If students don't have enough time to develop the skills that they need to succeed, then they will go with the more familiar method of assessment, just because when you're time poor, it's difficult to imagine yourself doing something new. So I think collaboration with students is really important. So speaking to students from the beginning about the fact that there's going to be this choice of assessment, these are going to be the choices, and building up on those skills. So, you know, maybe you would have a low stakes piece of assessment where students would have to gain the skills to do a podcast, do a presentation, to do a poster, whatever it is. So they're actually developing as they go through. Consider which module, and this is important. So look at the different modules that you have and think which one might be the most appropriate to introduce choice. So probably not a final year module if students have never experienced choice before. And maybe or maybe not a first year module, because students are coming straight out of quite often a different educational environment where they don't have that much choice. So you may need to kind of gradiate this and think of it more as an iterative process rather than straight away introduce it into every module. And again, looking at your program approach. So if you know, okay, well, in second year, I'm going to have choice of assessment for students. Then in first year, I'm going to make sure that we work on the skills development that students need for these assessment methods. So when they're then presented with the choice, it is an equitable choice because they've had a chance to practice both of these types of assessment before. This is the equity template, which Geraldine developed. And it's something for you to complete, but then also to share with students. So you're giving this information to students. So you've got your space for your 2 assessment methods. What's the weighting? So in terms of the percentages that they're worth, what are the details of the assessment? Why might it suit a particular student? And I think that's really, really useful information to give to a student. What are the learning outcomes that are being assessed? What are the criteria? How is there equity in the marking procedures? So maybe looking at Geraldine's given the example of examiners there, but even the rubric as well, making sure students have the rubric across both types of assessment so they can see how it matches up. Looking at equity in the teaching and learning activities to support the assessment. So again, that you're giving students the resources they need. There's a class on poster creation, there's a class on presentations, that you've got equity in the feedback mechanisms as well. So how you're going to actually give students feedback, and we'll talk about exams in a minute and how feedback is possible for those. But there should be equity across the process, including your feedback for students. And then the workload expectation as well. This is an example from Evelyn Doyle, who had introduced choice of assessment. So she's got the different hours that it might take. So if it's poster, so for poster design group meetings and then researching, as opposed to, you know, preparing and rehearsing an oral presentation in group meetings, etc. These are all useful exercises for you if you're considering introducing choice of assessment. So again, looking at how we're going to scaffold student supports or scaffold student development in terms of diversity of assessment. So teaching skills for new assessment types, as we talked about, providing your rubrics, your samples, your examples, so students can see. So if you're going to ask a student to do a video, and I would have seen lots of people trying to introduce video assessments last year and the year before, and sometimes not very successfully, because students A, didn't have the skills they needed to create a video, and B, had no idea what that would look like at the end. Like, what would the end product be? They know what an essay looks like at the end, or they have a vague idea depending on which year of a program they're in, but they may have no idea what a video assessment would look like. So you need examples for students to actually look at and see, not necessarily on the same topics. Obviously, you don't want to encourage students to copy what they've seen before, but they do need to be able to see some kind of tangible examples of that assessment type. Providing resources and guides. Again, if you don't have time to build in classes on podcasting or classes on presentations, that there are actually other resources and guides and examples that you can provide to students through your virtual learning environment. So it doesn't necessarily have to take up your contact time, but that you are actually providing what students need. And to co-create with students, to look at negotiated assessment as well. So that's quite an interesting one. And again, you'd need to select your module very carefully to talk to students about, you know, how much should this be worth? How much should that be worth? When we look at our co-create our rubric, what are we looking for in this at the end? And negotiating that through with students so that students feel a real sense of ownership then over that piece of assessment within their module. So again, with the +1 approach, it's small, significant changes. So it might be choice within an assessment. So let's say at the moment you do have a timed exam. Well, is there choice within that timed exam? Are there different types of questions that students can do that would still help them to demonstrate that they've met their learning outcomes? Can you start with diversity of assessment from the beginning? So right from the beginning, looking at your assessment methods and starting to introduce that as diversity from first year. Add one new assessment type to one module. So, you know, don't go overboard thinking you're going to redo absolutely everything, but look for an opportunity. Don't sacrifice familiarity for total innovation. And I can't emphasize that enough, because you'll be very disappointed with the results if you scrap everything that every student will be familiar with for everything that's brand new, because students, as I said, just like us, are very fond of what's familiar, and that feels safer to students who might be experiencing stress in other aspects as well. And consider which module you're going to use, as I said. So I think Rebecca shared with you a particular exercise that I've used in workshops like this before, where we look at different assessment types or assessment modes. And we start to consider how we might universally design each assessment mode. So obviously there is an infinite number of assessment methods that you might use in your modules. So it might be a traditional exam, a timed exam, multiple choice questions, short answer questions, essays, presentations, posters, videos, artifacts, projects. There's any amount of things that you might use. And really the key is to think about what are the skills that are required for students to do this piece of assessment? How does it link to the learning outcomes? Is it fair in terms of how we're going to assess this particular piece? We look at academic integrity. So whether or not students are completing the work themselves, or they understand that concept, the authenticity, which we've talked about, and very importantly, how you're going to provide feedback on that piece of assessment. So looking at the traditional exam, which unfortunately is still the most popular method of assessment in a lot of areas, then how do we provide feedback after an exam? Well, students might get a grade, they might get a percentage. What does that mean to students? Are they learning from that? Are they able to take that grade and go, okay, well, here are the pieces I need to work on for next year on my assessment? Usually not. Sometimes students can contact you and ask for feedback, but as we all know, they're not necessarily going to do that, and they probably aren't going to do that. So I might just stop sharing at this point and we can have a chat through the exercise just for a few minutes. There we go.
Fantastic.
So let's have a look. So if we looked at traditional exams, so that's the first one. So what I had given to Rebecca was a piece from Phil Race, who's done loads of work on assessment. I'm sure you're already familiar with him. And he looks at a number of different types of assessment. And he gives the kind of what he says is the status of that assessment around the validity and fairness, around, he calls it whodunit, which is the academic integrity piece, real world, which is your authenticity, and then how you're going to give feedback. And he talks about advantages and disadvantages. In this exercise, what I've asked you to do is think about the pros and cons for that method of assessment when it comes to universal design. And then if we are sticking with this method of assessment, how do we universally design that method of assessment? So does anybody want to turn on their mic and have a chat about what you think is, what are some of the pros of exams when it comes to universal design?
I think you'll find, I know some of our lecturers do use in the very appropriately positioned exams, but in general, we've moved away from exams. I'd be interested to know how many people who are in the room right now actually have exams. So if you maybe could raise your hands, I think there's a reaction. Is there a reaction button at the bottom there for y'all?
Yeah, it should be.
Great. So if you, yeah, let me know if you, so Stephen has his hand up. Just Stephen, is it so far? That's it. So one person in the room actually uses exams in their modules.
I do as well, Rebecca. I just can't see the little hand here.
Oh, it's in reactions. It's down the bottom there. It says reactions. There's a little happy smiley face with a plus on it. Marina also uses exams. Great. And Catherine does as well. So, yeah, so it might be kind of interesting to maybe bring, you use MCQ in class. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So I think in terms of pros when it comes to exams around universal design, it is a familiar mode of assessment to most students. Most students have done an exam before, they understand how it works. So there is that kind of familiarity aspect to it. And exams suit some students in terms of the way they learn. And a lot of our students are well practiced at exams before they come through our doors. So there is that, I suppose, benefit to it. And sometimes, and we hear this quite a bit from students, the workload is less for an exam than it might be for a piece of continuous assessment. So, I mean, that can be useful for students as well. And there can be an authentic method of assessment depending on your subject area. So the example I normally give is in medicine, they have steeplechase exams or OSCEs where they're presented with a case on the spot in a timed exam and they have to, figure out how they would deal with it. That's a really authentic method of assessment. That's exactly what they're going to do when they leave their college course. So, I mean, there are some pros to exams. I mean, the cons, I think we're probably all very familiar with around universal design, which is the stress and anxiety that can be caused to students around timed exams. And that, I mean, that is a challenge. And exams don't suit a lot of students. So students who don't perform well under pressure, for example, or sometimes students with disabilities don't have access to their assistive technology tools that they might use for a piece of continuous assessment. Examining speed of writing rather than genuine knowledge. Absolutely, Lucy, completely agree with that. And if you're somebody who can write really fast and you have a good short-term memory, then maybe you can do well in some exams. Whereas if you're somebody who really does have the knowledge from the course, you don't necessarily have the opportunity to demonstrate that in a timed exam if that's just not a method that suits you as a learner. Doesn't always accurately reflect the knowledge. Now, that completely depends, obviously, on the design of the exam. So there are some exam designs that may work better than others when it comes to that. So, for example, problem-based learning, where a student is reacting to a problem, that can work well. But again, if you're looking just at written and handwriting, then that's an issue. I mean, still in UCD, we're primarily talking about handwriting exams, which, I mean, that's not authentic no matter what way you look at it, because it's not what students do the rest of the academic year. We're not expecting them to handwrite. In fact, we won't accept a handwritten essay from a student. They have to type. But then when it comes to their exams, we're expecting them to handwrite. So some things you can do if you do still have timed exams is obviously having the sample papers and working through the papers with students so they get really familiar with what that exam format might be. ensuring that feedback is possible. And I think that's the big challenge around a terminal exam, is how you work in feedback for students, actionable feedback that they can take on board in the following year. Look at the variety of your question types and make sure that you do have some choice within the exam, and give sufficient time for all students as well. So you know that a lot of students with disabilities would have extra time in timed exams, but try to think about giving everybody as much time as they could possibly need, because there will be lots of students who would benefit from extra time who don't have the paperwork, for example, that they would need in order to get that extra time. And how do you overcome that in a timed exam format? Make sure that students understand the rubric for the exam just as they would for a piece of continuous assessment. So what are you going to be looking for in this exam? What's being assessed? And above all else, make sure that it's not worth 100% of the grade, I think is the key message. I think a lot of work has been done in UCD as well to eliminate the 100% terminal exam, but there are still some modules that have 100% terminal exam. And unfortunately, a lot of them are in final year for our students, which is a real issue. Did anybody else have any thoughts on how we would universally design timed exams, or any of the pros and cons around those timed exams?
Yeah,
I should disclose that I'm very anti-exam.
I am too. Sorry, not that I'm anti. I know it's appropriate for certain
things. Well, I'm
yeah,
from.
I've never taught those certain things, and I kind of, when I first came in, I was expected to be doing exams, and I kind of was like, this is nothing, has nothing to do with the real world experience of this profession. So that was the main reason that I felt that the exams weren't appropriate. In a way, they can be comfortable for students because they're used to the exam process here in this country, particularly. One of the things you possibly could do is do a formative feedback exam, that you could feedback previous to, like the mocks, something along those lines might be helpful. But yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of other, there's a multiplicity of different ways in which people in the room assess the work. So that you might want to speak to that. But Louise, you've got your hand up, so.
Yeah, like Jeff, definitely in my area in IT, there are industry exams. There's just so much knowledge you need to have. And there's industry exams in so many different areas of IT. And I just think we kind of need to prepare our students for that, because those industry exams are expected by industry to get a job. Absolutely. So if we don't prepare them to have that style of exam, they're not going to have that experience leaving college.
Absolutely fair.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose broadly speaking, it's looking at the systemic issue with why those exams are required in general, or why that's the only thing that's required in the industry, but you can't control that where you are. So you're totally right that we need to prepare students, and there's lots of disciplines like that.
Shows their level of knowledge. That's what it's all about. That someone can't spoof their way saying, oh, I did this module, that they really know the stuff. And that's what the exams assess what they know.
See, now I would say that there's lots of ways to examine, what they know. And the more ownership they have of that, the more they're going to own what they've actually achieved through your course, through the module. But I completely get what you're talking about. If
with some modules in IT where it's much better if they have a project for sure, but there's some where they just need to show that they know all this stuff.
Yeah. Catherine's got your hand as well.
Yeah, I have to say I kind of agree with Louise in terms of preparing them for industry relevant situations whereby an exam is perceived as the way of testing knowledge. I was thinking about it. I find the people who do well, the students who do well in exams, are typically the students who attend. Sorry, I should say it in the negative. The students who don't do well in exams typically are those who have not attended lectures consistently. Well, those who do very well we generally have a good attendance pattern at lectures, or have studied the content in some capacity before, or have a talent for the content. But I've only, from a recollection, I only experienced the negative correlation with exam performance with those students who don't attend classes.
But don't you find that's true as well with CAs? Those that don't attend the work that they produce in a continual assessment arena can suffer as well.
Yes, but if you put that work through Turnitin, you can see how much of it is genuine knowledge versus how much of it is taken from the internet.
I think there will always be students who don't attend and then attempt to do their piece of assessment in a bad way.
Yeah.
And I think so. I suppose the discipline that I taught was English, and that's where I'm coming from, where exams make absolutely no sense whatsoever.
Catherine, you're in finance, so they may well do.
Yeah. And certainly in terms of accountancy exams and things like that, there's preparation that students need in that particular discipline, and you're not doing them any favors by not preparing them for those industry exams. In fact, you're doing them, you're creating a disadvantage for that student if they're not prepared for the industry exams.
Yeah, I think it's just as well, if you move, I suppose, slightly away from the UDL point of view, and so if you're a lecturer with multiple students and multiple different types of assessments, one of the advantages of an exam is that it's got it happens on a specific day, you know, and it's got a specific deadline, and it's very easy to manage. And you know, it kind of, in that regard, it blends into your whole overall kind of assessment schedule. If you're a lecturer teaching through multiple modules, it's a very clean and efficient way of doing things.
Absolutely, and I hear that all the time in terms of the time it takes to grade an exam versus a piece of continuous assessment. And you're right, and as I said before, it suits some students and it can be less of a workload than a piece of continuous assessment. But while one of the advantages is that it's on a particular day, one of the disadvantages is that it's on a particular day. It's only one day, one time, one shot, off you go. And if you're having a bad day because you have a migraine or because your kids didn't sleep the night before or whatever it might be, then you're already at a disadvantage, which is in no way your fault on that particular day of the exam. And how do we account for that? Because if it's a one time only, or maybe there's a repeat, but I mean, that's not ideal. I mean, there are loads of challenges that come, and the more diverse our student population gets, the more these challenges will come up in terms of being able to engage in those timed assessments. And there's a difference as well between a timed assessment that happens in a giant scary hall like down in the RDS versus one that you can do remotely yourself online or even remotely in a classroom. So there's, you know, not all timed exams are created equally. So there's all those aspects to consider as well with students, and how you would provide, or how you might provide supports to students in the timed exam environment, where a student can use their assistive technology tools as an example. But it's always really interesting to hear people's perspectives on exams. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Those are all really excellent points, I have to say. But you know what? When they go out into the big bad world, you know, life is scary too.
Oh, absolutely.
And,
it's very scary.
You know, when they go to their first interview for a real job, it's kind of scary.
Yeah.
And they have to do their preparation.
And that's where, I mean, actually part of the authentic business assessment that I was talking about in IADT is an interview.
Absolutely.
And I think that's really good. And I mean, you're right in that, you know, we're not talking about protecting students to the point where they don't gain the skills. We're talking about supporting them to gain those skills as they go through their program. So not avoiding things. And I think sometimes that's what people think as well. So we have lots of students, for example, who want to avoid presentations. They would do anything other than give a presentation. But it's our responsibility to make sure the student gains that skill before they leave their program. So it's looking at how you assess students with presentations all the way through, how they gain the skill. They're not dropped in at the deep end when in their first interview they're expected to do a presentation, as so often happens. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be supportive in our approach in terms of how students gain these skills. And we quite often hear well, when they leave college, where they're not going to have this, or they're not going to have their assistive technology, or they're not going to have whatever support it might be. But it's our responsibility, I suppose, to change things in the way that we can, and to have a supportive environment for all of our students so they can gain the skills that they need and the confidence that they need. So we're rapidly running out of time. So what I'd say with that exercise is to work through it in your own time. And to think about those different assessment methods and use it as a reflective tool for yourself in terms of how you're assessing and how you're universally designing. You're not necessarily going to change all your assessment methods, but it can get you to think about, well, maybe I need to give an extra resource here, or students might benefit from talking through the rubric over here, or maybe I'll look at the percentage that this is worth. It's a useful kind of reflective exercise. And Lucy, yeah, I'll send the slides to Rebecca when we're finished. Just before we finish up, I want to, because you had asked me about this, Rebecca, in terms of the accessibility of the documents. So
this is specifically regarding our UDL class. One of the things that we were talking about was Blackboard Ally, that something that Paul's going to go into a little bit more with Column and tomorrow. But I kind of thought, wow, when the documents were on Blackboard, the Blackboard Ally was giving them really high marks. And sometimes I find my own are like at 50% and I can't move them up. So I asked Lisa, would she share? So thank you so much for taking this on.
Yeah, no problem at all. So we've introduced Ally as well last year, and it's been a fantastic tool, and we've seen lots of engagement with it. It's great. There's nothing like giving somebody a score or a coloured dial to motivate action when it comes to accessibility documents. So I have this kind of accessible content checklist that I would use. I use it in most of the workshops that I do to help you to work through when you're creating material. So I use sans serif fonts because they're more readable. On slides, I have a minimum of size 24, or if it's print, then it's 12. I avoid underlining and italics and block capitals because all of those things impact readability. Every image that I have has alternative text if it's an image that's trying to convey meaning. If it doesn't, then I tick, this is a decorative image. And that's probably where a lot of people are falling down in terms of alternative text on images, and the same for tables and graphs. Make sure that you have a good color contrast. That's something else that gets picked up on. And that you for readability, you should left align your text rather than justify it or right align. Use the heading styles that are built in, whether you're talking about PowerPoint or Microsoft Word, rather than just saying bold and make it bigger for a heading. Actually use the heading style function, because that means somebody who's using a piece of screen reading software can tab through your document using the headings. Other than that, they have to listen to the entire document to get to the piece that they need. Use the Microsoft Accessibility Checker, which I'll show you in a second. Have meaningful URL links. So eliminate click here from everything that you have, and actually just put the link into what it is. So if it's the AHEAD website, for example, that's what the link is, it's the AHEAD website. So get rid of saying click here. Make sure that you have captions on your videos, and the easiest way, the lowest cost way to do that is to put your videos on YouTube and edit the captions on there. So depending on your accent, they'll work really well or not work well at all. I have a nice generic boring accent, so they work really well for me, but maybe not so much for others, and it's getting better all the time. And there's actually on Zoom, and I know on Teams as well, there's you can turn on live captioning that's done through a piece of software, so you don't necessarily have to have a captioner. And having those things as reasonable accommodations can really help. So the Microsoft Accessibility Checker, are you familiar with this already? Yeah.
I don't know if everyone is, but I am. Yeah.
Yeah. We looked at it last week, didn't we?
Oh, did we? Yeah. Okay. I can't remember.
Did Trevor, maybe Trevor showed it to you, did he? And did you have Trevor in? So it's really, really useful. I use it on every single thing that I create, because there's always pieces that you're going to miss, and it talks through everything in terms of the alternative text on every image. And as I said, don't be afraid to take this as decorative if it really is decorative. So for example, the image here, I wouldn't tick this is decorative because I'm giving you some information, which is, you know, that you're going to click check for issues and then check accessibility. But some of the images I had previously were all decorative, so I'm not giving you any information, so I wouldn't go from that. So I'm going to stop there. There's some more information in the slides, particularly around how to write alt text, which can be a challenge. But essentially, if you follow all the guidance on the accessibility checker, you should get a high score. And I try to give people documents in PowerPoint or in Word rather than as PDFs, because inaccessible PDFs is another big issue that comes up. And in the recent audit of the public sector websites, this is where all the institutions of education fell down, all of the universities, all of the ITs all fell down because of inaccessible PDFs on their websites. So if a document starts life as an accessible Word document or a PowerPoint presentation, if you click Save As, a PDF, it should maintain its accessibility. Whereas if you print it to PDF, it flattens it and removes all the accessibility that was in the original document. But if you give people the Word documents or the PowerPoints, they're the most flexible. So if, for example, I want to increase the font size or I want to change the color, when I'm looking at it, I can do that because I have the original document. So consider doing that. I know lots of people don't like doing that in terms of copyright, but rest assured that OCR works really well now and none of your content is safe. So even if you give it to someone as a PDF, they can take all the text back out of it again. It's a lovely positive note to end on.
But thank you for that cheery update. No, thank you so much. I mean, that was fantastic. Lots to chew over. And this recording will be available to those that are in class. It will be on Blackboard. If anyone else would like a copy, I will put it up somewhere and I'll make it accessible to others. And Lisa,
I should say, Rebecca, as well, that next week we have our University for All Symposium, which is
we're going to be
all,
there, girl.
yeah, great, all focused on universal design for learning, and we have Thomas Tobin as well, which is great. So hopefully some of you will be able to come to campus, and I'll see you there if you do.
Absolutely, because they've got ice cream there, we've heard.
Yes, there's going to be 99s at the break.
And that's very important for with the summer. I mean,
absolutely. So it'll probably rain, but we'll still have ice cream.
Regardless, it'll be great. Yes, no, I've put that on the Teaching Learning newsletter, but to remind everybody, it's the 26th. Time it's from 9:30. Is it
from 9:30 till 2? Yeah.
2. Yeah. So it's live and online.
There's lunch included as well in the new UCD Student Village. So another.
Well, I'm hoping we're going to take a field trip across. So I'll definitely be there in person. And I hope to have some others with me. We might even take the bus together, the 46A. Can't wait. So it'll be lovely. Thank you so much, Lisa. There's a lot to consider in what you've spoken about. I particularly liked your caveat about the word champions, because I think that's true. Sometimes it does feel as though lecturers are getting a lot put on them. But thank you. And, you know, I think this is, once you do the work on your modules, it's there, and it actually can unlock your imagination in a lot of different ways to start considering, and it makes your life more enriched, more fulfilled, and the work is more exciting for all of us. Thanks again. We look forward to seeing you all very soon. Lots of cool things on the thing, super interesting, lots of helpful practical ideas. Thanks very much, Lisa. Really interesting and helpful. Thank you, Lisa. That was from Catherine. Yeah, so we'll have to have you back.
Thanks very much for having me.
Pleasure. Marina also as well, who's from Sallynoggin, so that's kind of nice. We've got a cross-institute, cross-further and higher education group for you today, which is fantastic. And thanks from a lot of other folks as well. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll all speak again very soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.